commercial and extractive industries are huge threats to apes. The unsustainable trade, and this is largely driven by increasing consumptions all over the world and the increasing numbers of people that are becoming richer, that want more commodities, more dependent on land and resources. And all of this is increasing the levels of consumption and therefore increasing the threats to natural habitats around the world. It's not just for apes, but all of these natural habitats contain important biodiversity, but also critical ecosystem services, which are essential for human survival. And so this is impacting not just threatened species, but also human survival. If we can go to the next slide. So to talk now a little bit more specifically about debt for nature and debt for nature swaps, the Tropical Forest Conservation Act, which was enacted in 1998 in the United States, was created specifically to find ways to use debt swaps to address conservation priorities. And so it's an old tool that has existed for quite a while. And actually, even before the creation of the Tropical Forest Conservation Act, there were debt for nature swaps that dated to the late 80s. I think, Russ, you were involved in some of those very early initiatives by Conservation International. And the main aims of these debt for nature swaps was to give countries that were heavily indebted and often poor debt relief and generate funds in local currency to support tropical forest conservation. So the aims were conservation of tropical forests and the biodiversity therein, but it was also aimed at strengthening civil society and providing mechanisms to give small grants to NGOs and local communities. And in most cases, there was a match or a contribution from the private sector to contribute to this. So it was building these public and private sector partnerships, which enabled engagement from a large range of sectors and funding to come from a diverse range of sectors. So in many cases, the debt reliefs that were agreed by the US government were supplemented by funding from other sources as well. We can go to the next slide. Some of these debt for nature swaps that were created, therefore, really looked at restructuring the way in which debt was held by a debtor country, swapping it or reducing it, or actually buying a portion of the country's outstanding debt and using that, selling it at a better price to obtain funds that could be used for conservation. And so a percentage of this debt was used to support conservation programs in the debtor's country. There were two types that were generally developed. The first type was debt that was owed to commercial banks, and those often included multiple partners and were administered by NGOs. And the second type, which I believe is the more common type and one that is found through bilateral agreements with many different countries, is an official public debt swap that is administered by the creditor government. So it's a government to government debt swap. And this was something that has been used by numerous governments around the world to countries that are indebted to them. If we can move to the next slide. So some of the different types of activities that this funding that was generated through these debt for nature were able to fund were, to a large extent, they funded the establishment or the maintenance of government protected areas and the biological diversity that was in there. And when I use the word protected areas, I'm talking about national parks, but also reserves and other types of land that was protected for the purposes of conservation. They were also used to train and build the capacity for protected area staff. Most of those are government employed staff because these protected areas are usually a network of government protected areas. And they also provided or aimed to provide support for forest dependent and local communities that were living near these protected areas and therefore who were dependent on resources in those protected areas. And the aim was to develop sustainable ecosystem and land management systems within those countries. And again, they also included different types of research that would enable better conservation practice to be put in place. So these 5 examples show some of the different things that the conservation funding that was generated through these debt for nature swaps. These are the kind of activities that were funded. Next slide. Yeah. There are some really great articles, and I've listed one here that does an analysis of the impact of primarily the second type of debt for nature swap, the bilateral debt for nature swap, and how it impacts forest loss and whether or not it actually had the intended impact of reducing or slowing forest loss. And this study in particular showed that by analyzing a number, 85 different countries, over the 15 years that these debt for nature swaps were done, it did show that there was a higher amount of conservation funding generated and that they were associated with lower rates of forest loss in the focal areas. So that's a very positive impact and indicates that one of the primary goals of these swaps was achieved. Whether or not it was fully achieved isn't said in the article, but definitely there was a lower rate of forest loss associated with these swaps. However, the focus on the impact on local forest communities indicates that they're often displaced by these activities because protected areas are created, national parks are created, and the people that would live there had to move somewhere else. And that often led to exacerbated deforestation in other places. So to some extent, you're just moving the problem to another area. And this is one of the challenges with these projects when they don't sufficiently take into consideration the needs of the local people that are living in those areas. Next slide. Now, I've been involved in one particular debt for nature swap. Russell, who's going to be speaking after me, has been involved in a lot more and has a lot more experience about this on this than I do. But the one debt for nature swap that the Arcus Foundation was involved in was the debt for nature swap between the US government and the government of Indonesia for conservation of the island of Sumatra. And it was created in 2009, and the US government forgave $30 million in debt to protect the forests of Sumatra. That was actually the largest ever debt for nature swap under the Tropical Forest Conservation Agreement. So the idea was that the Indonesian government would put $30 million in trust, where the relief on the debt of the 30 million would be put in trust over the next 8 years for the conservation of forests and their restoration and the conservation of wildlife. And the flagship species here were orangutan, rhino, tiger, and elephant, because those are they all exist and coexist in the forests of Sumatra. It's the only place in the world where you have all of these animals in one place. It was also a public-private partnership with a funding contribution by the private sector. The Arcus Foundation contributed to the match, as did others. And so it was a very significant amount of money that was generated for conservation in Sumatra. Next slide, please. I think the analysis of the impact is early. So we're very, very early days. The funds have not all been expended. There's a lot that can still happen. So these are just some of the preliminary ideas that have been generated about the impact of this debt for nature swap. But one thing that we do know is that Indonesia is only second to Brazil in rates of forest clearance. And Indonesia is also a country that has a huge amount of debt. And it depends enormously on land, agriculture, and natural resources to meet its debt obligations. And so this debt forgiveness of 30 million was just a tiny fraction of Indonesia's debt. And so it doesn't really change the formula for Indonesia in terms of needing to cash in on its natural resources to meet its remaining debt obligations. What we do know from experience from other places is that debt for nature swaps are successful if they are very closely aligned with the government's policy priorities. And it does appear that the Indonesian government has very strong policy priorities towards reducing deforestation, meeting climate change objectives, and protecting its biodiversity. Those are still difficult to put into practice, and there's a lack of capacity and a lack of integration of these policy priorities into the national and local systems across the country. So they don't always translate into the decisions that are being made by local authorities. There's also a consensus that debt for nature swaps, to be successful, must align with the community's needs and the priorities and livelihoods. And that aligns back to the point that I made earlier about displacing communities and just moving the problem elsewhere. So it's very important that communities are engaged in the process very, very early on, and that they are part of the decision-making process rather than just included at the end once all the decisions have been made. And what has been found from the orangutan debt for nature swap is that it's very challenging, and it's still challenging for local organizations to access these funds. And therefore, the funds are not yet flowing adequately, easily to community, local organizations, and tend to be used primarily or accessed primarily by international conservation organizations. And I don't think that's the intention of the fund that was created. So those are some of the findings from the orangutan, and we can move on to the next slide, from the orangutan experience. But as I said, it's not fair to judge it too much yet, because we do still have time. There is still a lot that needs to be done. This particular debt for nature swap, which, as I said earlier, is the largest ever, was led by Conservation International, but it worked very closely with an Indonesian organization, the Kehati Biodiversity Conservation Trust Fund, as well as Global Wildlife Conservation. And the Arcus Foundation contributed financially. We were not involved in any of the technical setup of the swap, but we did contribute financially to as a private sector match for it. If we were to look at the need and really think about orangutan conservation to effectively address some of the priority challenges, we need to be generating funds in excess of $2.5 million per year for the next 20 years. And so the scale of funding that is required is far, far greater than the funding that is currently available for conservation. And so, although there are challenges with this mechanism, there are huge opportunities as well. And I think that there's a need to look at it creatively, to look at multilateral as opposed to just bilateral agreements, to look at ways in which we can ensure that the funds are more accessible to local organizations and flow more readily to the needs and priorities of communities living in these landscapes, and to really ensure that it's possible to really focus the conservation actions on the conservation action planning processes, which are led to a large extent by a consortium of conservationists and scientists from all different nationalities that are coordinated together under the section for great apes and the section for small apes under the IUCN Primate Specialist Group. And they spend a lot of time developing conservation action plans for different regions and different species. And if these debt for nature mechanisms can be tied to the conservation action planning process, then we have a chance that they will really be effective and targeted and address the priority needs on the ground. So I think I've talked enough, and I'm going to hand it over to Russ, but I hope somebody is capturing the questions that are popping up on my screen. I have to admit that my concentration is not capable of speaking and reading and answering at the same time. So I hope somebody is capturing those so that we can use those in the discussion. Thank you.
Over to you, Russell.
Yeah, hi. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, thanks. Well, for those of you who don't know me, I'm currently the Chief Conservation Officer at Global Wildlife Conservation. Prior to that, I was 28 years at Conservation International. I also chair the IUCN Species Survival Commission Primate Specialist Group, which deals with not just apes, but primates all around the world. Now, at Conservation International, I was been kind of around the whole debt for nature swap process since it started. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the history of it, but maybe I'll just give a quick recap. The concept was first developed by Tom Lovejoy, who's an American scientist working mainly in the Amazon region of South America. And he came up with the idea in 1984. The first debt for nature swap was actually done by Conservation International in 1987. And it was a very simple one. It was a private donor giving $100,000 to buy $600,000 of Bolivian debt, which was put into a mechanism to fund what was then called the Beni Biological Reserve. $600,000 was a lot more back then than it is now. Costa Rica immediately followed suit, and that kind of opened the door to all sorts of debt for nature swaps, which took place during the 1990s in particular. One count that I saw had that 38 countries that engaged in debt for nature swaps. It's probably more than that, but well over $1 billion put into these mechanisms. They tended to slow down a little bit in starting around 2000 because of debt forgiveness and higher values for some of this commercial debt. But the Tropical Forest Conservation Act and the example that Annette gave for the orangutan shows that this sort of thing is still feasible, and I think we need to investigate more how we might do it in different countries where there is still this kind of debt available. Specific to Madagascar, this is one of my focal areas. I've been working there for about 36 years. If you look at primates worldwide, we recognize 4 major regions in which primates occur. The South and Central America, the Neotropical region, mainland Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and China. And then Little Madagascar, which is only about 2% of the African region, we recognize as an entire major primate region in and of itself. We have 111 species and 15 genera. That's a significant portion of the world's primates. We're actually still describing new species every year. In 1994, when we did our first field guide there were 50. Now we're at 111. We have at least another 10 still to be described. It is certainly the single highest major primate conservation priority in the world. The lemurs are the most threatened larger group of mammals, with more than 90% in the critically endangered, and vulnerable categories. We have 8 priority sites that we've identified, but there are many dozens of sites that need attention very quickly. Could you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, and Madagascar is one of the top 5 global biodiversity hotspots, not just for primates, but for biodiversity in general. Because of its long isolation, evolution has kind of gone its own course in Madagascar. We have extremely high levels of endemism, not just at the species level, but at the generic and family level as well. So you have entirely distinct evolutionary lineages that are found only there and could very easily disappear in the next few decades. 90% of the natural vegetation has already been lost. About 10%, the 10% remaining is about 50 to 60,000 square kilometers, which for the Americans listening, that's about 2 or 3 New Jerseys. So a very tiny area with an enormous concentration of unique species found nowhere else. In terms of the lemur conservation activities in particular, there are a number of actors there, international actors, but our organization, Global Wildlife Conservation, Omaha Zoo and several other zoos, Bristol Zoo in the UK, and a number of really good national organizations in Madagascar are the principal actors in terms of lemur conservation. And we estimate that the conservation funding need for lemurs overall is about $2 million per year over the next 20 years, and that would get the job done. There was a Debt for Nature swap years ago in Madagascar. It created a fund, a biodiversity fund there that doesn't work very well. And this indicates some of the problems that you have with these funds that are created, which I can go into in a little more detail if you'd like later. And I think I'll end there and see if we can answer some of the questions. But I also want to mention that we have on this call Dirck, who is our vice chair in the Primate Specialist Group for Great Apes. He also works for Global Wildlife Conservation, and he's been very active in looking at a variety of different sources of funding for great ape conservation. I don't know, Dirk, do you want to say a few words as well about some of the things you've been engaged in?
Sure, real briefly, and then we'll get to questions. We're right now, in terms of the great ape situation, looking very carefully at the COVID-19 and thinking about how we can be most proactive about preventing any kind of transmission into the ape population. While there hasn't been any proven transmission yet, it's something that we're very carefully looking at the moment. But more importantly, looking at long-term funding solutions for some of these ape populations, especially some of them that have been responsible, dependent on tourism, and now we're seeing a huge loss of revenue. So I don't have anything prepared remarks for this, but I'll leave it at there and let Russ and Annette answer your questions. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I think that's fascinating and important challenge for us to scale Debt for Nature that was shared. In terms of folks that have questions, there were some that were typed in. If there's individuals who want to ask a question live and they want to raise their hand in the chat, you can just raise your hand here and let me know if you'd like to ask a question. We can also share if you've been working with a group of fellow Debt for Nature Hackathon participants and you have an idea about Debt for Nature that you want to share vis-a-vis some of what was offered here, whether that could apply to the Madagascar context or the Indonesia context. We've certainly seen that there's a diversity of countries who own debt in some of these countries as example. So I want to see if there's individuals who'd like to ask a question. I see Bonnie wrote about where these are chronicled. Is there a centralized place where all of the Debt for Nature history is, or is that distributed really?
It's, as far as I can tell, it's pretty distributed. I haven't seen anything that summarizes everything in one place. There are mechanisms looking at trust funds, and many of these Debt for Nature swaps created trust funds. For instance, in Latin America, you have something called REDLAC, which is the network of Latin American countries that have trust funds. And again, these were largely created with Debt for Nature swaps. But as far as a central body that looks at all of these, no, I haven't seen anything.
So I also see this question of, do the local communities benefit? And I think that's part of what you described, that the fund, that if there's a local fund, but you also said it doesn't work very well. So I guess the question is, when they ask, do locals benefit, how have Debt for Nature connected to local economic regeneration that makes it possible to keep the conservation intact?
Sorry, if I could just quickly, Russ, just for the previous question, and then I'll let you jump in. I'd forgotten that I was on mute. There is a repository for on a country-by-country basis, so you can look up all the Debt for Nature swaps that the U.S. government has done, for example, and I think the U.S. government has done more than any other. But it is, as Russ said, distributed. Every country will have their own register of those projects. Russ, please carry on.
Yeah, in terms of the trickle down to local communities, there's a huge degree of variation in the success of this sort of thing. In some countries, those who run the funds that have been created by these debt swaps are inclined to sit on the funds, just to put it very bluntly. And sometimes access to these funds can be very difficult, even for local organizations, local NGOs. And from the local NGOs, it then has to trickle down to the local communities. And you know, I'm not very happy overall with the way this has been managed. I think as we create more of these, we have to put much more emphasis on ensuring that there's rapid transfer of funds. They tend to become very bureaucratic, and it can take many months or years to release funds, when in fact, if we could put in place action fund type mechanisms that release these funds within a month or two, sometimes even just small amounts going to these communities, it would have an enormous impact. So I've been overall, and having been involved in a lot of these, I've been overall fairly disappointed in the way they've worked. But that's not to say some of them have done a good job.
So one thing I'd like to add to that is, as I was saying earlier, for many of the ape species and primates and lemurs, there are conservation action plans that have been developed that are very thorough, well thought through, and involve lots of different partners, including in the really good ones, communities and local groups. So it is really important that when debt for nature swaps are developed, that those local communities are consulted in the development of them early on, rather than just all the way at the end when it's set up. And that the mechanism, as Russ was saying, the mechanism for disbursement of funds is tied to an action plan, a conservation action plan, so that you actually already know this is where the funding is going to go. This is how it's going to be spent. And these are the priorities that have to be addressed. And that it's not like a competitive bidding process where people control those funds. It would be a critically important funding mechanism for these conservation action plans.
Yeah, I think that it's also important to recognize that a lot of the action in biodiversity conservation in general is at the very local level, where the absorptive capacity for large amounts of funds doesn't exist. So being able to distribute funds at a scale that's commensurate with the absorptive capacity of these actors in the field, and to do it quickly, is absolutely essential. And most of these funding mechanisms that have been created are not structured in that way. Annette mentioned the action plans. Our specialist group has done many action plans. And lest you think we're only worried about primates, because you have three primatologists talking here. Primates are also extremely important as flagship species for tropical forest areas in general, because 90% of all primates are tropical forest species. And in terms of one of the best mechanisms for empowering local communities, which is appropriate ecotourism, they are very often in tropical rainforest region the #1 species of interest for tourists, and you know, the great apes being an outstanding example of this.
I see 3 questions coming in order of Sanjay, then Cheryl, then Bonnie. Sanjay, did you want to phrase the question you typed? I'm not quite sure if I've fully been able to understand it from the text, so maybe you could speak to it.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Sanjay? Yes.
Okay, so, you know, I am on the mailing list of Survival International, which focuses on indigenous groups being left alone and not looking at assimilating them into the global diaspora. So there have been some contradictions. When we think in terms of nature, we don't consider indigenous groups. So I was just curious in terms of debt for nature swaps. Maybe it was answered a little bit in the prior question. How much is that considered in terms of indigenous groups and the impact on them when you're focusing on nature conservation?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Sanjay. And I would say, as Russ did earlier, this has been a really weak aspect of it. And it's partly because they've been bilateral agreements between governments that have looked at these funding mechanisms as a way to relieve debt and to get money out. But then there hasn't been enough thought of what happens with those funds and how do we get it to the right people on the ground. And so many of these projects have ignored the needs of the local communities, and particularly Indigenous communities who are at times not as able to write proposals or ensure that their voice gets heard and to ensure that they are at the table when these decisions are being made. And so this is an area where huge improvement can be made and has to be made, because we are seeing a lot of challenges around how protected areas are created, how protected areas are managed, and the lack of consideration of the needs of local forest-dependent communities.
Yeah, Indigenous people are absolutely critical as partners and stakeholders in this whole process. For the terrestrial world, I've seen anywhere from 20 to 25% of the terrestrial planet being in the hands of Indigenous peoples. And our organization works a lot with Indigenous communities. And just in the past few months, in response to the Amazon fires, we created, I think it was an $8 million fund for supporting the fight against these forest fires. A good portion of this went to Indigenous groups in countries like Brazil and Peru, Colombia, Bolivia, and we intend to increase that substantially. Now, in terms of the debt for nature swap funding mechanisms that have been created, again, coming back to the point that I made and Annette also made, that accessing these funds for small groups, and especially for Indigenous communities, which often don't have the infrastructure or the capacity to write the proposals to access these funds, it has not been stellar, let's put it that way. And as we move forward with these kinds of funds, we have to put in place mechanisms that are much more effective in that regard. But I think a lot of the creation, a lot of the protection of natural areas as we move forward over the next few decades is going to be through what we're calling Indigenous and community-owned conservation areas, which are already at about 12%, 13% of the planet. And if you look at the Amazon region, it's going to be even more of the growth that happens in Amazonia is going to be through these indigenous groups. Unfortunately, in Brazil right now, with the government that's in place, this is going to be challenging, but hopefully that government won't be around for too much longer. And then, of course, you have the added problem, again, in the Amazon, of the uncontacted groups. There's an estimate there's about 50 uncontacted tribes in Brazil, probably at least 20 in Peru. I know almost for certain that in the country of Suriname, there's a couple. So they obviously have no access whatsoever to any of the resources. And how do we engage in ensuring their long-term viability? Probably the best thing to do is just leave them alone.
Well, I think that what you shared about the political context is, I don't know if there's a history of left and right adopting debt for nature, but perhaps the economic incentive of debt forgiveness might encourage some more conservative governments to also be open to it. But that's just a question that I was having when you said that. But I see we've got questions from Cheryl, then Bonnie, then Jaap, and we also have Sonia here. So Cheryl, did you want to ask a question still? Okay, I don't hear Cheryl.
Sorry, I was trying to get off mute. Hi, everyone. This is Cheryl Brown. I'm just trying to get a little bit better picture of how navigating with these local governments and what the obstacles are with getting those funds distributed either to the local communities or in a more effective way.
Huh. Well, I think it's very
Interesting question. Sorry.
Yeah. Are you ready for an answer or a response?
That'd be great.
Sorry, I had some background noise there. Yeah, I think the way the management structures for these funds are set up is really important, because I think that the donors have to keep at least some seats on any boards to make sure that there isn't mission drift. what I've seen is in some of these mechanisms is there's a lot of mission drift, and whoever's in charge of that particular fund decides to fund what he or she wants as opposed to what was in the original plan for the fund. And also, just to me, the most important piece of this is to have rapid dispersal of resources, because in this business with never-ending crises popping up all the time and the needs of local communities in particular becoming greater and greater, we can't have 1, 2, 3 year evaluation and approval processes for these grants. There just has to be more agility and flexibility in getting these resources out. Even if it's in smaller packages, there's an absolute need to get these funds out as quickly as possible.
Annette, did you want to add anything on that question, or should I go to the next question?
No, you can go on to the next question.
Okay, terrific. So Bonnie, would you like to ask the next question? You raised your hand earlier. You wrote who/what determines a good conservation action plan. Did you want to add anything further to that?
No, I just want to say thanks. Well, they have been answering in the chat box, so thanks so much. And I just want to say, yeah, I've been exploring kind of Indigenous evaluation as a practice, and so this is just really helpful for me to think through as an impact evaluator.
Yeah,
and how to approach this. Thanks.
Yeah, I also want to say that the IUCN has an entire conservation planning specialist group among the Species Survival Commission specialist groups. And this is focused on species, but species and their habitats. And they have some pretty elaborate guidelines for how to put together an action plan and how to evaluate it. And, as I say, in our specialist group, we've done dozens and dozens of these plans, and many of them have been quite successful, some more than others, but there are mechanisms in place that show you how you should put together an action plan. And then in a number of cases, we've done follow-up evaluations and new action plans that have looked at the impacts of the earlier one. So this is a long-standing process. The first SSC action plan actually was put together for 2 groups of organisms. One was the crocodiles, and the other was the primates back in 1978. That's quite a while ago, and we've been refining the process ever since.
We've had a couple of questions from YAP, which are around how to motivate creditors and the countries who are, holding the debt, and or who basically are in a position to forgive it or make a swap. And I think that's a very interesting question, and I think Russ might know more than I do. But one of the there's a whole range of different motivators, which has to do with governments wanting to meet their sustainable development goals or their climate targets, at the sort of high level government commitments. But then you also have motivators that are much more personal, where we have had members of the US government visit gorillas in Central Africa, and as a consequence really become very motivated to do something to ensure that these forests and these wildlife can be protected. So there's a whole range of different reasons why people care. Sometimes it's because they feel that it's something that the voters are interested in, or shareholders of a company are interested in. Other times it's because they personally carry a very strong commitment and motivation for environment and sustainability. And other times it's to help meet commitments that the government has made. So I think all the different strategies we have are useful. But Russ, you've probably got experience of actually convincing people to do this.
Yeah, the interesting thing about that example that you mentioned, where the members of Congress, U.S. Congress, were brought to Africa, the big push, this goes back to the early part of the last decade in the Congo Basin Forest Partnership, that was mostly Republicans who were interested in it. And the Republicans seem to be more interested in conservation in other countries than at home. But, Dirck actually ran the Congo Basin Forest Partnership and the Great Ape Fund in the U.S. government. So maybe, Dirck, you want to say something about experiences with that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, as Russ said, Colin Powell was actually kind of where the genesis of, who's a Republican, I think the Department of State at the time led a delegation. And we've been very successful when there's been political leaders like that going over and seeing things firsthand. It almost, not always, but can lead to the legislation and appropriations. I think Annette might have touched on another example where a couple staff members of both Republicans went over to Rwanda and viewed mountain gorillas, and we've seen increases in great ape appropriations resulting in that. So, I mean, I think getting people, influential people in governments over to see the issues and get invested in the issues is probably one of the best ways I've seen motivating. And more than sending them, briefings and reports, but actually having people from the field come and talk to them specifically about their projects and the realities they're facing seems to be really good ways of motivating. You can put any kind of report or piece of paper in front of somebody and hope they see the logic in it. But once they actually see with their own eyes or hear the voices of the people who are facing these issues, it's a whole nother bag. So I think those ways have been effective, in my opinion.
Yeah, getting people out, decision makers and donors out to see what's going on in the field firsthand is amazing. I remember in 1987, I took a donor group to Madagascar that included a member of the Washington Post, a writer for the Washington Post. He subsequently wrote a story about the visit, and it was front page news in the Washington Post. And I later heard that there was I experienced it, that there was a significant increase in funding for Madagascar from USAID simply because of that piece in the Washington Post.
Well, it sounds like there's been transformation through serendipity. I think getting that to the scale of the collective challenge is another purpose for this context of our hackathon. I wanted to just see if I saw that there was a comment from Ashumi and a comment we have also Yangbo. Yangbo, did you want to offer your comment or question here?
Yes, to elaborate a bit further about, because a lot of this conversation, rightfully so, is on Indigenous peoples, and same during the previous session, I was just off a Signal, a collaborative, that it's good that it's getting more and more focused. Now, the biggest area of concern is that amongst those Indigenous peoples, that have there been many initiatives, actually many coordinated initiatives to provide capacity building. So basically, instead of treating them as an object of charity, which I see many NGOs doing these days, quite honestly, has there been an attempt to actually enable them to economically empower themselves by judicious management of their own natural assets? So has that been explored much, that angle in terms of capacity building?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can give you one example. Another country where I spent a lot of time is Suriname. I mean, some of you may not know where Suriname is, but it's in the Amazon region north of Brazil. It's the greenest country on earth. It has about 93% forest cover, only about 600,000 people in an area the size of New England in the United States. And we've been working with two indigenous groups in the southern part of Suriname, which is part of the Guiana Shield Wilderness Area, which is the most intact rainforest left on Earth. There are about between 2,000 and 3,000 indigenous people living in this community, and we recently worked with them to self-declare an area of 7.2 million hectares. It's about 18 million acres of their land as basically a community-owned protected area. And just last week, we got new legislation passed by the government of Suriname, an entirely new environmental legislation put in place to facilitate a lot of the work that we've been doing there. And one of the focal areas for us has been both livelihood development with them. We're focusing mainly on non-timber forest products, and also training, bringing them up to a higher level of capacity and all sorts of things, from use of drones to satellite imagery analysis to medicinal plants and so on and so forth. So this is happening in a number of places, and it's absolutely a top priority.
We're getting close to the original official time, but I did want to mention that Grant asked the question of what are low-hanging fruits for the future of Debt for Nature. and that might also be helpful for folks. But my apologies in that I didn't mean to speak at the same time you were starting. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, I just want to add that I think, Yangbo, your question is really important. And I think some of the organizations that we are partnering with, like the Forest Peoples Program and others like that, are their main mission is about how to ensure that Indigenous people are at the table making these decisions. And when these decisions are being made, because like you say, so often they are passive recipients of the largesse of others, and that's not the role that they should be playing. And so I think that there needs to be a lot more, but it needs to be integrated into these high level government to government schemes or private sector schemes like the debt for nature swaps. And that's a big challenge because as you know, the language people speak is very different and the way they behave is very different, and ensuring that they can contribute meaningfully in shaping those kind of projects is critical.
I think that there's an important challenge. That's part of the aspiration of if everywhere there were targets for what debt for nature in theory were needed, and then you could work one by one, country by country towards that. There might be ways to scale it, but I think there's also challenges. Jaap, did you want to ask the question that you've been sharing? You wrote about monitoring and the value of debt for nature. Yep. Okay, no. Okay, so look, I see last commentaries in this to bring this to a. Oh, I see Alejandro's just asked a question. Alejandro, did you want to share this? Alejandro Del Mar? No. Okay, so I just want to share. I think it's phenomenal to hear from our guests, speakers here today. I think it's been an incredible experience to learn from their perspective on how debt for nature has had challenges, but there is a further conservation and regeneration opportunity if we seize it. What? Sorry, technical difficulties to unmuters, and yeah, but. What I'd also identify is we're getting closer to the edge of time. So what I want to say is three things. One is to the degree to which folks have additional. Go ahead, Tanuja. So next steps. So next step vis-a-vis debt for nature. From speakers, we could ask that same question in terms of what are the next steps for the world for debt for nature. I think that vis-a-vis the hackathon, immediate next steps are if folks haven't already created teams, please do so, and this meeting room will remain open if the Debt for Nature conversation wants to continue beyond the official end time of 1 minute from now. If folks want to continue the discussion, I think that the intention is to see over the next 2 days what are the ways in which our creative research and systems change hackathoning could accelerate debt for nature globally to address the scale of the challenge. I think that Russell and Annette have been eloquent in articulating the challenges of that. And I think, Annette, did you want to share any last concluding words? And I'll invite Russell to do the same. And then we can let an open discussion continue in this room if folks have additional time. And otherwise, it can continue on Slack. Annette?
Yes, I don't have any concluding words apart from to say that I have written my email on the chat section. If anyone does have any follow-up questions or they would like to talk to me afterwards, please feel free to do so. And the Arcus Foundation has produced a series of books together with the section on great apes of the Primate Specialist Group on the impact of industry on apes and ape conservation, and it's looked at extractive industries, industrial agriculture, and infrastructure as 3 separate volumes, and will also be putting out a book very soon on the impact of hunting and illegal trade. So these books might also help give people a little bit more detail, probably more detail than any of you would ever want, but a little bit more detail on the impact of human development on apes and ape conservation, but also looking at some of the potential solutions that exist.
Phenomenal. And Russell, did you want to offer any closing words?
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank the organizers for putting this together. I found it very, very interesting. I would also ask if the Skoll Foundation might be interested in supporting some sort of an analysis of Debt for Nature worldwide, as it's been carried out basically since 1987, and at the same time identifying, this is the most important part, identifying those countries where significant debt opportunities still exist. That would be a great help to all of us, and it would enable us to look at ways from a global perspective at how we might engage in another wave of these debt for nature swaps, if in fact the current debt situation globally warrants it and would make it productive. So that's all from my end. Thank you all, and I'm going to have to sign off.
Phenomenal.
Bobby, yeah. Bobby, can I just jump in quickly, please?
Yeah.
Yeah. Obviously, apart from thanking it, and it was an honor and privilege, Annette, Dirk, and Russ. Really appreciate you jumping in last minute, and obviously a few hiccups in the beginning, but a fantastic session. Going to what you just said, Russ, I mean, this is what Sustainavistas and CrowdDoing, we're doing it this week. We got into this basically 3 or 4 weeks ago. We put in a proposal to the European Investment Bank, and our ultimate goal is to try and see if we can actually get this onto the agenda, COP26, with some countries and people like yourself. So we just see this as a start and a facilitation process, and we'd love to have you guys on and Annette and some of the other organizations that you're working with, and also maybe work with maybe the Madagascar example, something that I really liked what Annette told me, what we shared on Saturday, and we'd like to go into a bit of detail. And obviously with our hackathon, just a last just reminder that on Friday we also have Chad Frischman from Drawdown to open the session and talk about the drawdown principles towards debt for nature, and globally also the solutions. Our drawdown is actually a big an alternative way of looking at than using just the SCGs. But once again, like I said, Russell, Dirk, and Annette, and everybody else on this call, please put your emails in the chat room if you want to have us to keep you up to date. And also show you where the copy of the recording is, and also where there's some of the answers, because I'm sure that Annette and Russ and Dirk will actually answer all the questions and maybe give you some more reports and documentation which we can share after this hackathon and session. But once again, thank you very much for joining us, everyone, and good night.
Terrific.
Okay, thank you.
Leave the room open if folks want to continue the discussion.